"Sir, you need to move along. The airport waiting area is for ticketed passengers only. I've been patient, but now you need to leave or I'm calling airport police to remove you," the airport supervisor, Mr. Reynolds, said coldly, glaring down at Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, 32, who was sitting uncomfortably in the airport terminal chair, his damaged prosthetic legs stretched out before him, a weathered military backpack clutched tightly against his chest. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "I wasn't loitering, sir. My flight to the VA hospital was delayed. I'm just waiting for an update," Mike replied, his voice steady despite the pain shooting through his leg. Mr. Reynolds sneered. "Delayed, cancelled, or non-existent. It doesn't matter. No ticket in hand means you can't stay. Those are the rules." He gestured to 3 uniformed airport security officers who approached with grim determination. 20 minutes later, as Mike sat abandoned on the hot concrete outside the terminal, sweat mixing with silent tears of humiliation, the distant thump, thump, thump of rotor blades cut through the air. Passengers and airport staff froze in disbelief as a military Black Hawk helicopter descended onto the small emergency helipad at the edge of the airport property, its presence an unmistakable declaration of authority. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez knew what it meant to endure. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him that survival wasn't just about physical strength, but mental fortitude. He'd endured the scorching heat of Kandahar province, the loss of his right leg below the knee from an IED on his final deployment, and 18 grueling months of rehabilitation at Walter Reed Medical Center. He'd even endured the painful dissolution of his engagement when his fiancée couldn't handle the new Mike, with his nightmares, mood swings, and prosthetic limb. What he hadn't expected to endure was homelessness in the country he'd sacrificed. So much to defend. The cascade of misfortune had been swift and merciless. First came the administrative error in his disability benefits. Payments suddenly stopped with no explanation. Then the rental assistance program that had been helping him was abruptly defunded. His meager savings evaporated within months, covering basic expenses while he fought an increasingly frustrating battle with VA bureaucracy to restore his benefits. Today, Mike was at Westfield Regional Airport, a mid-sized facility that served as a hub for several smaller cities in the area. His appointment at the specialized VA prosthetics clinic in the neighboring state was critical. His current prosthetic leg, damaged in a fall last week, was causing him excruciating pain with every step. The connection flight had been delayed due to mechanical issues, leaving him stranded for at least 5 more hours. His prosthetic, a basic model provided by the VA, had been giving him trouble for months. The socket no longer fit properly after he'd lost weight from stress and inconsistent meals. The knee joints squeaked and locked at unpredictable moments. The fall last week had damaged the alignment, making walking and exercise in agony. But the nearest specialist who could help was 3 states away, and this flight was his lifeline. Mike carried everything he owned in a desert-colored tactical backpack from his service days. A change of clothes, his discharge papers, prescription medications, a worn photo of his platoon taken just days before the IED attack, and his purple Heart and Bronze Star medals still in their original cases. He never displayed them, but couldn't bear to part with them either. They were tangible proof that his sacrifice had meant something. The Westfield Regional Airport was a study in controlled chaos that afternoon. Business travelers hurried between. Gates families corralled excited children, and airline staff managed the constant flow of humanity with practiced efficiency. The main terminal boasted high ceilings, rows of uncomfortable seating, and the constant hum of announcements over the PA system. Mike had found a quiet corner near Gate 12, which was temporarily empty between flights. He'd stretched his aching, prosthetic leg out, trying to alleviate some of the pressure points that had begun to blister his stump. He wasn't trying to hide or cause problems. He had a legitimate ticket just for a delayed flight. He simply needed to rest his leg and wait. The first sign of trouble came when a custodial worker gave him a suspicious glance, then spoke quietly into her radio. Minutes later, Gerald Reynolds, the airport operations supervisor, approached with a security guard trailing a few steps behind. Reynolds was a man who lived by rules and procedures. In his 15 years overseeing operations at Westfield, he'd developed a sixth sense for what he called airport irregulars, people who didn't belong in the carefully controlled environment he maintained. To his eyes, Mike, with his worn clothes, unshaven face, and military backpack, fit the profile of someone potentially looking to use the airport as temporary shelter. "Excuse me, sir," Reynolds began, his tone professionally detached but with an undercurrent of authority. "May I see your boarding pass?" Mike looked up, momentarily disoriented from a haze of pain and exhaustion. "My flight's delayed until 7:30. Connection to Minneapolis." He reached into his jacket pocket for the crumpled printout of his boarding pass. Reynolds barely glanced at it. "This is for a flight that won't depart for over 5 hours. You can't occupy this space for that long. There's a waiting area before security that's more appropriate." Mike tried to explain. "Sir, I've already cleared security. My leg," he gestured toward his prosthetic, "makes going back and forth difficult. The VA arranged this flight to get my prosthetic fixed. It's damaged and causing me pain." Reynolds' expression didn't soften. "I understand, but we have policies about loitering in the gate areas. They're designed for passengers with imminent departures. If your flight is 5 hours away, you'll need to relocate to the main terminal waiting area." "But I am a passenger," Mike insisted, his frustration mounting, "and this area is empty right now. No one needs these seats. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. "That's not the point," Reynolds countered, his patience visibly thinning. "The point is policy, and right now you're in violation of it." A small crowd of curious onlookers had begun to gather, drawn by the escalating tension. An elderly couple exchanged concerned glances. A businessman frowned disapprovingly at Reynolds. A young mother pulled her curious child closer. Mike struggled to maintain his composure. His military training had instilled in him a deep respect for authority and rules, but this felt profoundly unjust. "Look, I'm not trying to cause trouble. I'm a disabled veteran trying to get to a medical appointment. My leg is killing me. I can't keep moving around." For a brief moment, something like uncertainty flickered across Reynolds's face. Then his expression hardened again. "Your status as a veteran doesn't exempt you from airport regulations. I'm going to have to insist you relocate or leave the secure area entirely." "Can I speak to your supervisor?" Mike asked, making one last attempt at reason. Reynolds' mouth tightened into a thin line. "I am the supervisor on duty. This isn't a negotiation. Move to the designated waiting area, or I'll be forced to have security escort you out." Mike looked from Reynolds to the security guard, who was watching the exchange with uncomfortable detachment. He knew when a battle was unwinnable. With painful slowness, he gathered his backpack and struggled to his feet, wincing as his weight settled onto his misaligned prosthetic. The walk back through the terminal was excruciating, physically and emotionally. Every step sent shockwaves of pain up from his prosthetic socket. Travelers stared, then quickly looked away. The security guard followed a few paces behind, as if escorting a criminal rather than a wounded warrior. When they reached the pre-security waiting area, Mike found all the seats occupied by travelers and families. There was nowhere to sit, nowhere to rest his leg. The security guard, his duty discharged, returned to his post, leaving Mike standing awkwardly with his backpack. "Excuse me," Mike said to Reynolds, who was already turning to leave. "There's nowhere to sit out here. What am I supposed to do?" "For 5 hours." Reynolds shrugged, unmoved. "That's not my department's concern. Perhaps try the food court." Without another word, he walked away, already talking into his radio about another matter. For several minutes, Mike stood there, swaying slightly, the pain in his leg building to an unbearable crescendo. A thin sheen of sweat covered his forehead. No one offered their seat. No one seemed to notice his distress. In a busy airport, a lone man suffering was just another inconvenience to navigate around. Finally, unable to stand any longer, Mike limped outside to the passenger drop-off area. There, he found a concrete planter with a wide edge and carefully lowered himself onto it. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, adding heat exhaustion to his growing list of miseries. As he sat there, defeated and in pain, Mike thought about how invisible he had become since returning from Afghanistan. In uniform, he had been thanked for his service, offered discounts, given respect. Out of uniform, with only his wounds and struggles visible, he had become something to avoid, to manage, to remove from sight. He fumbled in his pocket for his phone, an older model with a cracked screen, but still functional. He had one number, rarely used, but memorized by heart. Colonel Sarah Iron Blackwood had been his final commanding officer in Afghanistan, the leader who had visited him daily in the field hospital after the IED blast, who had pinned his Purple Heart to his hospital gown, who had promised him that he would never be forgotten. "If you ever need anything at all, you call this number directly," she had told him at his medical discharge ceremony, pressing a card into his hand. "No matter where I am or what I'm doing, that's an order, Rodriguez." He had never called. Like most soldiers, he believed in handling his own problems, in not burdening the chain of command with personal issues. But sitting outside Westfield, regional airport, in pain, humiliated, with no hope of making his critical medical appointment, Mike realized he had reached his breaking point. With trembling fingers, he dialed the number. The phone rang once, before being answered by a crisp, professional voice. "Colonel Blackwood's office." "This is Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, 2nd Battalion, 5th Regiment," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "I need to speak with Colonel Blackwood. It's urgent." There was a brief pause. "One moment, Sergeant." Seconds later, a familiar voice came on the line. "Rodriguez, is that you?" Colonel Blackwood's voice was exactly as he remembered, authoritative, direct, but with an underlying note of genuine concern. "Yes, ma'am," Mike replied, military formality automatically reasserting itself. "What's wrong? You sound like hell." In concise, unemotional terms, the way he would have delivered a field report, Mike explained his situation. The delayed flight, the critical medical appointment, his damaged prosthetic, and the humiliating ejection from the airport terminal. As he spoke, he could hear Colonel Blackwood's breathing change, becoming measured in the way he recognized from missions when she was controlling her anger. When he finished, the silence stretched for several seconds. They removed a decorated combat veteran with a visibly damaged prosthetic leg from a waiting area and left him outside with nowhere to sit. Her voice was dangerously quiet. "Yes, ma'am." "And you're at Westfield Regional right now, sitting outside in the heat?" "Yes, ma'am. Drop-off zone, east entrance." "Rodriguez, listen to me carefully." Colonel Blackwood's voice had shifted. "Into command mode. You stay exactly where you are. Do not move from that spot. I'm currently at Fort Carson leading a training exercise, but I'm diverting resources immediately. ETA 20 minutes. Understood?" Mike blinked in surprise. "Ma'am, I don't want to cause trouble. That wasn't a request, Sergeant." She cut him off. 20 minutes, do not move." The line went dead. Mike stared at his phone in disbelief. Colonel Blackwood was at Fort Carson, nearly 50 miles away. What resources could she possibly divert that would reach him in 20 minutes? And more importantly, why would she go to such lengths for a former soldier with a delayed flight? As the minutes ticked by, Mike's curiosity gave way to anxiety. Had he overstepped by calling? Would her intervention make things worse? He considered calling back to tell her not to bother, but years of military discipline prevented him from countermanding a direct order. 18 minutes after the call ended, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors cut through the ambient noise of the airport. At first, Mike assumed it was a medical evacuation to the nearby hospital, but as the sound grew louder, he realized with dawning amazement that it was approaching the airport itself. Travelers stopped in their tracks, faces turned skyward. Airport. Staff emerged from the terminal, hands shielding their eyes from the sun. A sleek, military-grade Black Hawk helicopter appeared over the tree line, its approach direct and purposeful. With practiced precision, the helicopter descended toward the small emergency helipad at the edge of the airport property, a landing zone typically reserved for medical emergencies or VIP transport. The downdraft kicked up swirls of dust and debris, sending nearby travelers scurrying for cover. Before the rotors had even begun to slow, the side door slid open. Colonel Sarah Blackwood emerged, not in flight gear, but in full-dress uniform, her chest adorned with combat ribbons and medals that glinted in the sunlight. Behind her came 4 soldiers in combat fatigues, their posture and movements marking them unmistakably as special operations personnel. Colonel Blackwood surveyed the area with the calculated efficiency of someone accustomed to assessing tactical situations. Her gaze locked onto Mike, still seated on the concrete planter. With purposeful strides, she headed directly toward him, her escorts falling into formation around her. As they approached, Mike instinctively tried to stand and salute, military muscle memory overriding his physical pain. Colonel Blackwood gestured for him to remain seated. "At ease, Rodriguez," she said, her voice carrying the same authority. It had in the mountains of Afghanistan. She looked him over, her experienced eyes noting his exhaustion, the awkward angle of his prosthetic, the tight lines of pain around his mouth. "I see the situation is exactly as you described." Mike, overwhelmed by her presence and the dramatic entrance, could only nod. "Ma'am, I never expected a helicopter," she smiled grimly. "When one of my soldiers is being mistreated, I don't believe in half measures. Now tell me which airport official was responsible for removing you from the terminal." Before Mike could answer, a small delegation of airport personnel was rushing toward them, led by a harried-looking man in a suit who Mike guessed was significantly higher in the chain of command than Reynolds. "Colonel Blackwood," the man called out, extending his hand. "I'm James Harrington, airport director. We received notification of your arrival just moments ago. May I ask the nature of this unexpected visit?" Colonel Blackwood ignored the outstretched hand. "Mr. Harrington, approximately 30 minutes ago, one of your staff members removed Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a decorated combat veteran with a Purple Heart and Bronze Star, from your terminal. Sergeant Rodriguez has a confirmed flight, a legitimate medical emergency, and a visibly damaged prosthetic leg that he received defending this country. He was forced to sit outside in the heat with nowhere to rest because someone decided policy was more important than humanity. I'm here to understand why." Harrington blanched. I wasn't aware of this incident. If you'll allow me to investigate." "By all means," Colonel Blackwood interrupted. "Start by summoning the supervisor." "Who gave the order? Gerald Reynolds, I believe." Mike stared at her in amazement. He hadn't mentioned Reynolds' name during their brief conversation. Harrington spoke quietly into his radio. The gathering crowd of travelers and airport staff had grown, many filming the confrontation on their phones. The 4 special operations soldiers remained in a loose formation around Mike and the colonel, their presence a silent reminder of the seriousness of the situation. Minutes later, Gerald Reynolds appeared, his earlier confidence notably diminished as he took in the scene before him. A full-bird colonel in dress uniform, special forces operators standing at the ready, and the airport director looking like he wanted to sink into the ground. "Mr. Reynolds," Colonel Blackwood addressed him directly, her voice carrying across the now silent drop-off zone. "I understand you were responsible for removing Sergeant Rodriguez from the terminal today. I'd like to hear your explanation." Reynolds swallowed hard. "Ma'am, I was following established protocol for non-imminent passengers. Our gate areas are reserved for travelers with departures within the next 2 hours. Sergeant Rodriguez's flight wasn't departing for over 5 hours. Did Sergeant Rodriguez inform you of his medical condition and the reason for his travel? He mentioned something about a VA appointment, yes. And did you observe his prosthetic leg?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "I noticed he had some sort of disability, but this some sort of disability is a below-knee amputation resulting from an IED explosion during his 3rd tour in Afghanistan." Colonel Blackwood cut in, her voice sharp as a blade. "Sergeant Rodriguez lost his leg serving this country. He received the Purple Heart and Bronze Star for his actions that day, which included dragging 2 wounded comrades to safety despite his own catastrophic injury." The crowd murmured. Several onlookers shook their heads in disgust at Reynolds. "Furthermore," Colonel Blackwood continued, "Sergeant Rodriguez is traveling to receive critical medical care for his damaged prosthetic, which is currently causing him significant pain. Care that he cannot receive locally because of systemic failings in veteran support services, and your response was to remove him from a comfortable seat in an empty gate area and leave him outside with nowhere to sit." Reynolds' face had gone pale. "Colonel, I was just following policy," she finished for him. "Yes, I'm familiar with that defense. It has a long and not particularly honorable history." She turned to Airport Director Harrington. "Mr. Harrington, I assume your airport receives federal funding?" He nodded, looking increasingly concerned. "Then you are bound by the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, both of which prohibit discrimination against individuals with disabilities. Reasonable accommodation is not just good practice, it's federal law." Harrington cleared his throat. "Colonel Blackwood, on behalf of Westfield Regional Airport, I want to extend our sincerest apologies to Sergeant Rodriguez. This incident reflects neither our values nor our standard operating procedures. I assure you there will be a full investigation and appropriate actions will be taken." "That's a start," Colonel Blackwood acknowledged, "but it doesn't solve Sergeant Rodriguez's immediate problems. He has a critical medical appointment that he's going to miss because of his delayed flight." She turned to one of her operators, a sergeant with communications equipment. "Sergeant Miller, contact the VA Medical Center in Minneapolis. Inform them of the situation and advise that we'll be arriving via military transport within the hour. Have them prepare to receive Sergeant Rodriguez immediately upon arrival." "Yes, ma'am," Sergeant Miller replied, immediately moving aside to make the call. Mike watched in stunned silence as Colonel Blackwood efficiently took control of the situation. The airport director, James Harrington, seemed equally stunned, caught between admiration for the colonel's decisive leadership and dismay at the public relations nightmare unfolding before him. "Now, Mr. Harrington," Colonel Blackwood continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "I'd like to see your airport's written policies regarding accommodations for disabled passengers, particularly veterans with service-connected disabilities. I'm also requesting the security footage of Sergeant Rodriguez's removal from the terminal." Harrington nodded rapidly. "Of course, Colonel. We can review those materials in my office immediately." He turned to Gerald Reynolds, who was standing, rigid with anxiety. "Mr. Reynolds, please collect the relevant documentation and meet us in the administrative suite." Reynolds opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it again and hurried away. Colonel Blackwood turned to the small crowd of travelers that had gathered. "Thank you for your concern, but this is a matter being handled by military and airport personnel. Please continue with your travels." Her tone was polite, but brooked no argument. The onlookers began to disperse, though many continued filming discreetly. She knelt beside Mike, her voice softening slightly. "Rodriguez, can you walk, or do you need assistance?" Mike's pride warred with the reality of his physical condition. "I can walk, Mom, but it's not going to be pretty." The colonel nodded, understanding the unspoken message. "Private Jenkins," she called to one of her team. "Assist Sergeant Rodriguez. We're heading to the director's office." The young soldier stepped forward immediately, offering his arm for support. Mike hesitated only briefly before accepting. As he struggled to his feet, the pain from his damaged prosthetic shot through him like fire, causing him to inhale sharply. Colonel Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "How long has it been this bad?" 3 weeks, ma'am," Mike admitted. "The sockets cracked and the alignments off. Been getting worse, especially after I fell last week." She shook her head in barely contained anger. "And they still scheduled your appointment 3 states away. This is exactly the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that drives me insane." She took a deep breath. "Let's get you inside and seated. Then we'll sort out this mess." The procession into the airport attracted considerable attention. Colonel Blackwood, in her dress uniform, flanked by special operations soldiers, escorting a limping veteran with Private Jenkins's support, followed by the airport director, who looked like he was marching to his own court-martial. Travelers stopped to stare. Airport staff whispered among themselves, and security personnel stood at attention as they passed. In the administrative suite, a large conference room was quickly cleared for their use. Mike was guided to a comfortable chair where he could stretch out his prosthetic leg. One of the soldiers produced a bottle of water and some pain relievers from a tactical medical kit, which Mike gratefully accepted. Reynolds arrived with a thick binder of airport policies and procedures. His earlier arrogance completely evaporated. The security manager followed shortly after with a laptop ready. "To access the surveillance system, pull up the footage from approximately 1 hour ago, Gate 12 area," Harrington instructed, his voice tense. As they watched the video playback, the room grew increasingly silent. The footage clearly showed Mike sitting quietly, not disturbing anyone, his prosthetic leg visibly extended. It captured Reynolds's approach, the brief conversation, and then, most damning of all, the forced removal with security guards flanking Mike as he struggled painfully to walk, his face contorted. With each step, what the silent footage couldn't capture were the words exchanged, but the body language told enough of the story. Reynolds pointing authoritatively, Mike gesturing to his leg, the security guards moving in close proximity like prison guards, with an inmate rather than assistants helping a disabled veteran. When the footage ended with Mike being escorted out of frame toward the exit, Colonel Blackwood turned to Reynolds. Her voice was dangerously calm. "Is there a section in your policy manual that specifically instructs staff to ignore medical distress in favor of enforcing waiting area regulations?" Reynolds swallowed hard. "No, ma'am." "Is there a policy that prohibits making reasonable accommodations for disabled veterans with visible prosthetics who are in obvious pain?" "No, ma'am." "Is there any policy at all that would justify the treatment we just witnessed on that video?" Reynolds stared at the floor. "No, ma'am." Colonel Blackwood turned to Harrington. "Mr. Director, I believe you have some decisions to make regarding Mr. Reynolds's continued employment and your airport's approach to disability accommodation. But first, I need to ensure Sergeant Rodriguez receives the medical attention he requires." Harrington nodded grimly. "I understand. Completely, Colonel. Rest assured, this incident will have serious consequences. He turned to Reynolds. Mr. Reynolds, you are suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation. Please surrender your credentials to security and leave the premises. Reynolds's face went from pale to ashen. Sir, my record has been spotless for 15 years. Surely one misunderstanding doesn't... This was not a misunderstanding. Harrington cut him off, his voice hard. This was a catastrophic failure of judgment, compassion, and professional responsibility, not to mention a potential violation of federal law. Please don't make this worse by arguing. Reynolds looked around the room, finding no allies. With shaking hands, he removed his ID badge and placed it on the conference table before walking out without another word. As the door closed behind him, Sergeant Miller returned from making his calls. Colonel, the VA Medical Center in Minneapolis has been notified. They're preparing to receive Sergeant Rodriguez as soon as we arrive. I've also taken the liberty of contacting Major Brooks at Veteran Support Services. He's initiating an expedited review of Sergeant Rodriguez's disability benefits case. Excellent work, Miller. Colonel Blackwood nodded. She turned to Mike. We'll have you on that Black Hawk and headed to Minneapolis within 15 minutes. The prosthetic specialist will see you immediately upon arrival. Mike shook his head in disbelief. Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you. This is above and beyond... No, Rodriguez, it's not, she interrupted firmly. This is exactly what should happen when one of our wounded warriors needs help. The failure here isn't your call to me. It's that you had to make that call in the first place. Harrington cleared his throat. Colonel Blackwood, Sergeant Rodriguez, I want to personally apologize for the inexcusable treatment you received today. While it doesn't make up for what happened, I'd like to offer a concrete response beyond disciplinary action. He reached for a notepad and began writing. First, we will be implementing mandatory sensitivity training for all staff regarding disabled passengers with special emphasis on wounded veterans. Second, we'll be creating a new airport policy named after you, Sergeant Rodriguez, the Rodriguez Protocol, establishing clear guidelines for accommodating disabled veterans traveling for medical care. He continued writing. Third, we'll be making a substantial donation to the Wounded Warrior Project in your name. And finally, you will never have to purchase a ticket at this airport again. You'll have lifetime priority boarding and access to our first-class lounges whenever you travel through Westfield. Mike was speechless. The transformation from being treated as an unwelcome intruder to having an airport policy named after him was so sudden and complete that he couldn't process it. Colonel Blackwood's expression softened slightly. That's an excellent start, Mr. Harrington. I'm pleased to see you taking this seriously. She checked her watch. Now we need to get Sergeant Rodriguez to his appointment. As they prepared to leave, the conference room door opened, and a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit entered, slightly out of breath. Colonel Blackwood, Harrington said, this is Charles Westfield, CEO of Westfield Airport Group and grandson of the airport's founder. Westfield stepped forward, extending his hand. Colonel, I was in a board meeting when I received word of this incident. I came immediately. What happened to Sergeant Rodriguez is inexcusable and reflects a failure at every level of our organization. He turned to Mike. Sergeant, on behalf of my family and our entire company, I offer my deepest apologies. I'm a veteran myself, Navy, not as decorated as you. But I understand the sacrifice you've made. The fact that you were treated this way at an airport bearing my family's name shames me deeply. Mike, still overwhelmed, simply nodded his acceptance of the apology. Westfield continued, Mr. Harrington has outlined some initial steps we'll be taking, but I want to add a personal commitment. I serve on the board of the National Veterans Foundation. I'd like to invite you, when you're feeling better, to speak at our annual fundraising gala about your experiences, both in Afghanistan and unfortunately today. Your story could help us raise significant funds for veteran housing and medical support. I'm not much of a public speaker, sir, Mike said hesitantly. Westfield smiled warmly. The most powerful speeches come from the heart, Sergeant Rodriguez, not from Polish. But there's no pressure. It's an invitation, not an obligation. Colonel Blackwood interjected. We can discuss future engagements later. Right now, Sergeant Rodriguez needs medical attention. Her tone made it clear that the conversation was over. Westfield nodded. Of course. May I accompany you to the helipad? I'd like to ensure your departure is smooth. With the CEO's involvement, their procession back through the terminal took on an almost ceremonial quality. Security cleared a path, staff stood respectfully aside, and travelers watched curiously as Mike was escorted through the airport with dignity that stood in stark contrast to his earlier treatment. Outside, the Black Hawk waited, rotors at idle, its crew standing by. Two of the Special Operations soldiers helped Mike board, ensuring his damaged prosthetic wasn't further stressed. Colonel Blackwood followed, pausing at the doorway to address Westfield and Harrington one final time. Gentlemen, I appreciate your responses today, but remember, this isn't just about one veteran or one incident. It's about a system that too often fails those who have sacrificed the most. I'll be watching with great interest to see how the Rodriguez protocol is implemented. Her gaze was steady and unflinching, because if I have to land a helicopter at another airport for a similar reason, I won't be nearly as understanding. With that, she boarded the helicopter. Within moments, the rotors spun up to full speed, and the Black Hawk lifted gracefully into the afternoon sky, banking toward Minneapolis and the medical care Mike so desperately needed. As the sound of the helicopter faded, Charles Westfield turned to Harrington. James, I want a complete overhaul of our disability accommodation policies. Bring in veteran consultants. Establish a dedicated support desk for disabled travelers, and I want the Rodriguez protocol implemented across all 17 airports in our group, not just Westfield Regional. Harrington nodded. Yes, sir. I'll begin immediately. And James, Westfield's voice hardened, find out how many other employees share Reynolds' attitude. I want a clean sweep. Westfield airports will be the most veteran-friendly travel hubs in the country, or I'll know the reason why. Meanwhile, aboard the Black Hawk, Mike sat in stunned silence as the landscape sped by below. The events of the past hour seemed surreal, from being thrown out of an airport to flying in a military helicopter, with a colonel who had diverted resources from a training exercise just to help him. One of the operators handed him a headset so he could communicate over the rotor noise. Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Blackwood's voice came through clearly. Our ETA to Minneapolis is approximately 40 minutes. How's the pain level? Manageable, ma'am, Mike replied automatically. The soldier's standard response regardless of actual discomfort. Colonel Blackwood gave him a knowing look. Rodriguez, this isn't Afghanistan. You don't need to tough it out anymore. Be straight with me. Mike hesitated, then admitted, It's pretty bad, ma'am. 8 out of 10. She nodded. Sergeant Willis is our medic. He's going to give you something stronger for the pain. Don't argue. As Willis administered the medication, Mike finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind. Ma'am, why did you do all this? I mean, I appreciate it more than I can say, but a helicopter, special forces operators, for a delayed flight and a rude airport employee? Colonel Blackwood was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost some of its command edge, revealing the person behind the rank. Rodriguez, do you remember what I said to your platoon before your last mission in Kandahar? Mike thought back. You said, in this unit, we leave no one behind, not on the battlefield, not in the hospital, and not when they return home. Exactly, she nodded. I meant every word. When you called today, you weren't just a soldier with a problem. You were one of mine, left behind, by a system that should have protected you." Her eyes, usually steely with command, showed a flash of genuine emotion. The helicopter wasn't excessive. It was necessary. Because when the system fails, sometimes you need to make a statement that can't be ignored. The medication began to take effect, dulling the sharp edges of Mike's pain. For the first time in weeks, he felt the tension in his body start to release. "I didn't want to bother you with my problems, ma'am." "That's the thinking we need to change," she replied firmly. "Asking for help isn't weakness, Rodriguez. Sometimes it's the strongest thing a soldier can do. The real battle for many veterans begins after they come home, and that's a battle no one should fight alone." As the Black Hawk continued its journey toward Minneapolis, Mike felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just for his immediate medical needs, but for his future. Colonel Blackwood's intervention had done more than solve a temporary crisis. It had reminded him that he still belonged to something larger than himself, that his service and sacrifice still mattered. The pain medication made his thoughts drift, and he found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had led him from the dusty streets of Kandahar to this moment, flying through American skies in a military helicopter because someone in power had decided he mattered. Sergeant Willis checked his vitals, nodding with satisfaction. "Pain level now, Sergeant?" "Down to a 4, Mike admitted. "Thank you. Get some rest," Willis advised. "We'll wake you when we reach Minneapolis." As Mike closed his eyes, lulled by the rhythmic thump of the rotors and the blessed relief from pain, he heard Colonel Blackwood's voice through the headset one last time. "Rodriguez, when we land, we're not just getting your leg fixed. We're going to address everything: your benefits, your housing situation, your ongoing medical care. I've already put calls in to people who can cut through the red tape. This isn't charity. This is what you've earned." "Thank you, Mom," Mike managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't thank me yet," she replied, a hint of her characteristic determination returning. "Thank me when we've fixed the system so the next veteran doesn't need a colonel and a Black Hawk to get basic dignity and care." As sleep claimed him, Mike realized that today's events would change more than just his immediate circumstances. The Rodriguez Protocol might help countless other veterans facing similar challenges. His humiliation had been transformed into a catalyst for positive change, and perhaps that made all the pain worthwhile. In the cockpit, Colonel Blackwood watched the landscape passing below, her mind already mapping out the next steps in her campaign to ensure Mike Rodriguez received everything he had earned through his service and sacrifice. This was just the beginning. The dramatic helicopter arrival at Westfield Regional had made a statement, but the real work would be in the systematic changes that followed. She had meant what she said. No soldier of hers would be left behind. Not on her watch. Not ever. The Black Hawk landed with precision on the helipad atop the Minneapolis VA Medical Center, its rotors slowing as medical personnel rushed forward with a wheelchair. Dr. Elaine Chen, the director of the prosthetics department, led the team personally. A clear indication of Colonel Blackwood's influence. In 15 years at the VA, Dr. Chen had never greeted a patient on the helipad. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she called over the diminishing rotor noise. "I'm Dr. Chen. We've got a team ready to evaluate your prosthetic immediately." Mike, groggy from the pain medication but more comfortable than he'd been in weeks, was carefully transferred to the wheelchair. Colonel Blackwood stepped out behind him, still immaculate in her dress uniform despite the helicopter journey. "Doctor," she said, extending her hand to Dr. Chen, "thank you for accommodating us on such short notice. Sergeant Rodriguez's situation is critical both medically and as a matter of principle." Dr. Chen nodded firmly. "Colonel, after your call and hearing the circumstances, I rearranged our entire afternoon schedule." "What happened to Sergeant Rodriguez?" is unacceptable. We're going to make this right." The efficiency of the VA Medical Center team was remarkable. Within minutes of landing, Mike found himself in a state-of-the-art examination room, where Dr. Chen and two specialists were already assessing his damaged prosthetic. "This socket is completely compromised," Dr. Chen said, her fingers tracing. "The hairline fractures in the prosthetic's connection point, and the alignment is off by at least 15 degrees. No wonder you've been in agony." She looked up, her expression professionally neutral, but with unmistakable undertones of outrage. "Who fitted you with this model? It's at least 2 generations behind current standard issue." "San Diego VA," Mike replied. "About 18 months ago. They said it was what was available under my benefits package." Dr. Chen and Colonel Blackwood exchanged a look that spoke volumes. "Well," Dr. Chen said briskly, "today you're getting our best, the Genesis Pro X with microprocessor knee and carbon fiber foot. It's what our active duty special forces use." She glanced at Colonel Blackwood. "I assume there will be no issues with authorization." "None whatsoever," the colonel confirmed. "I've spoken directly with the regional VA director. Sergeant Rodriguez is to receive whatever he needs, immediately, and without bureaucratic obstacles." As the examination continued, Colonel Blackwood stepped outside to make additional calls. Mike could hear snippets of her conversations, sharp, authoritative interactions with various officials and administrators. She was systematically dismantling every barrier that had been placed between him and the care he needed. Dr. Chen worked with focused intensity, taking measurements and making notes. "We'll need to create a new socket, perfectly fitted to your residual limb, and you'll need physical therapy to adapt to the new prosthetic." She looked up from her tablet. "Normally this process would take weeks, but we're expediting everything. You'll have your new prosthetic tomorrow." Mike blinked in surprise. "Tomorrow? I was told the waiting list was months long." Dr. Chen's expression tightened. "It shouldn't be, not for any veteran, and certainly not for someone with your service. Record and medical needs." She hesitated, then added more softly, "The system doesn't always work as it should, Sergeant Rodriguez. But sometimes it takes someone like Colonel Blackwood to remind us all of our true mission here." After the examination, Mike was escorted to a private room. Not the standard ward he had expected, but a spacious, comfortable space typically reserved for high-ranking officers or VIP patients. A nurse brought him a proper meal, the first he'd had in days, and informed him that his new prosthetic fitting would begin first thing in the morning. Colonel Blackwood returned, now accompanied by a tall, distinguished man in a tailored suit, who introduced himself as Richard Daniels, the Regional Director of Veterans Affairs. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Daniels began, his manner deferential in a way that suggested Colonel Blackwood had been quite persuasive, "I want to personally apologize for the failures in your care. There is absolutely no excuse for a decorated combat veteran to experience what you've gone through." Mike nodded cautiously, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected attention from someone so high in the VA hierarchy. "I've reviewed your file," Daniels continued. "The suspension of your disability benefits was an administrative error that should have been corrected immediately. Those benefits are being reinstated retroactively with expedited processing of all back payments." He handed Mike an official letter confirming these actions. "You should see the funds in your account within 48 hours. Mike stared at the letter, the implications slowly sinking in. Financial stability, the ability to afford housing again, the crushing weight of economic uncertainty lifting from his shoulders. "Additionally," Daniels continued, "we've identified and corrected the classification error that restricted your prosthetic options. You're now properly categorized as a Priority Group 1 beneficiary with service-connected disability, entitling you to our highest level of care and the most advanced prosthetics available. Colonel Blackwood, who had been standing silently by the window, finally spoke. Mr. Daniels has also agreed to conduct a systematic review of all Afghanistan and Iraq veterans with prosthetic needs to ensure no one else is experiencing similar issues. Daniels nodded. We're implementing what we're calling the Rodriguez Review Initiative. Any veteran with a service-connected amputation or prosthetic need will have their benefits and medical care automatically audited to ensure they're receiving everything they're entitled to. The conversation continued, with Daniels outlining additional measures being taken: expedited housing assistance, coordination with local veteran service organizations, and a personal case manager assigned specifically to oversee Mike's ongoing care. When Daniels finally left, promising to return the following day to check on Mike's progress, Colonel Blackwood sat in the chair beside the bed. "Rodriguez," she said, her voice gentler than he'd ever heard it, "I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Why didn't you call me sooner, before things got this bad?" Mike looked down at his hands. "Marines are supposed to be self-sufficient, ma'am. We don't complain. We adapt and overcome." "That's in combat," she corrected him. "This is different. This is a broken system that requires collective action to fix. No amount of individual adapt and overcome can address systemic failures." She leaned forward, her eyes intent. "Listen to me carefully, Rodriguez. What happened today? The helicopter, the confrontation, all of it, wasn't just about getting you the care you needed. It was about making a statement that could not be ignored. Sometimes systems only change when they're shocked into it." Mike nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "But here's what I need you to understand," she continued. "Your suffering was never necessary. Not for 1 minute. The country made a promise to you when you enlisted, and another promise when you were wounded in its service. You fulfilled your end of that covenant completely. The failure was not yours for needing help. It was the system's for not providing it automatically." Colonel Blackwood stood and moved to the window, looking out at the gathering dusk. "Tomorrow, after you get your new prosthetic, we're going to have a longer conversation about your future. Because this isn't just about fixing your immediate problems. It's about making sure you have a purpose going forward." The next morning brought a flurry of activity. Dr. Chen and her team arrived early, bringing with them components for Mike's new prosthetic. The fitting process was meticulous, a far cry from the rushed, assembly line approach he'd experienced at his previous VA facility. "The Genesis Pro X has adaptive technology," Dr. Chen explained as she worked. "It learns your gait patterns and adjusts automatically to different terrains and activities. The microprocessor knee provides stability and natural movement that will reduce fatigue and prevent falls." As the components came together, Mike marveled at the lightweight, sleek design, so different from his old, clunky prosthetic. When the final adjustments were made, Dr. Chen stepped back, ready to try standing. With a therapist on one side and a technician on the other, Mike carefully rose from the fitting chair. The sensation was immediately different, more stable, more responsive, as if the prosthetic was working with his body rather than against it. "Take a few steps," Dr. Chen encouraged. "Let the system begin calibrating to your movements." Mike took one step, then another. There was still discomfort. That was inevitable with any prosthetic, but the searing pain that had been his constant companion for months was noticeably reduced. By his 5th step, he found himself moving more naturally, the prosthetic responding smoothly to his intentions. "This is incredible," he said, unable to keep the emotion from his voice. Dr. Chen smiled. "This is what you should have had all along, Sergeant Rodriguez. Now let's get you through some basic training with it before Colonel Blackwood returns." The morning passed in intensive therapy sessions, with Mike learning to maximize the capabilities of his new prosthetic. By lunchtime, he was walking confidently down the hospital corridors, the difference in his mobility dramatic and immediately visible. Colonel Blackwood arrived shortly after noon, accompanied by two civilians, a woman and a man, both in their early 40s, with the poised, observant manner of former military. "Rodriguez," Colonel Blackwood greeted him. "You're looking like a new man. How's the prosthetic?" "Life-changing, ma'am," Mike replied honestly. "I can't believe the difference." "Good, because I have some people for you to meet." She gestured to her companions. "This is Rebecca Torres and Marcus Washington. They run Frontline Forward, a veteran advocacy organization based here in Minneapolis." Torres stepped forward, extending her hand. "Sergeant Rodriguez, it's an honor. Colonel, Blackwood has told us about your situation." Washington nodded. "We're former Army Rangers. Started Frontline Forward 3 years ago after experiencing our own challenges with the VA system." Colonel Blackwood moved to the center of the room. "Rodriguez, I promised we'd talk about your future. Here it is. Frontline Forward needs someone to head up their new outreach program for recent Afghanistan veterans struggling with the system. The position includes housing in their residential facility, comprehensive health benefits, and a salary competitive with the private sector." Mike stared at her in disbelief. "Ma'am, I appreciate the thought, but I don't have any experience in advocacy or outreach." Torres smiled. "You have the only experience that truly matters, Sergeant. You've lived it. You know exactly what our veterans are going through because you've been there yourself." Washington nodded agreement. "We don't need another administrator or bureaucrat. We need someone who understands the struggle from the inside. Someone who can connect with veterans who are too proud or too beaten down to ask for help." "Your experience at Westfield Airport wasn't just a personal injustice," Torres added. "It was a symptom of a much larger problem. Veterans falling through the cracks, facing discrimination, struggling to access the care and benefits they've earned. You can help us change that." Mike looked from Torres to Washington to Colonel Blackwood, trying to process what they were offering. Not just a job, but a purpose, a way to transform his own painful experiences into something that could help others. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "Say yes," Colonel Blackwood suggested simply, "because the next veteran who gets thrown out of an airport or denied proper medical care might not have a direct line to someone who can send a Black Hawk to rescue them. They'll need an advocate already on the ground. They'll need you." The clarity of her words cut through Mike's hesitation. She was right. His suffering could have meaning if he used it to prevent others from experiencing the same. "When do I start?" he asked. Torres smiled. "As soon as Dr. Chen clears you for regular activity. We have an apartment ready for you at our residential facility. It's fully accessible with all the amenities you'll need." Washington added, "The Rodriguez protocol at Westfield Airport is already making news in veteran communities. People are talking about it. You have a platform now, a chance to speak for those who aren't being heard." For the first time in longer than he could remember, Mike felt a sense of purpose washing over him. The past months of struggle and humiliation suddenly seemed like preparation for something meaningful, something larger than himself. Over the next 2 days, as Mike continued therapy with his new prosthetic and prepared for discharge, a steady stream of visitors arrived. VA officials ensuring his case was properly resolved, veterans service organizations offering additional support, and even journalists requesting interviews about his experience and the changes it was sparking. Charles Westfield, the airport's CEO, called personally to inform Mike that the Rodriguez protocol had been implemented across all 17 airports in the Westfield group, with additional airlines and airport authorities reaching out to adopt similar policies. On the morning of his discharge, Mike stood in front of the mirror in his hospital room, hardly recognizing himself. The proper nutrition and care of the past few days had already begun to restore some of his former vitality. His new prosthetic moved naturally beneath his jeans, barely noticeable to observers. Most significantly, the defeated look in his eyes had been replaced by something else: determination, purpose, and hope. A knock at the door announced Colonel Blackwood's arrival for his discharge. "Ready to begin your next mission, Rodriguez?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," he replied with genuine conviction. As they walked toward the hospital exit, where Torres and Washington waited to drive him to his new home, Colonel Blackwood spoke quietly. What happened at Westfield Airport was wrong on every level. But sometimes it takes a dramatic failure of the system to create an opportunity for real change. Your suffering has already improved the lives of countless veterans you'll never meet. The Rodriguez Protocol will ensure that no disabled veteran faces that kind of discrimination in airports again. She stopped, turning to face him directly. But that's just the beginning. The real work starts now. Because every time you share your story, every time you reach out to a veteran in crisis, every time you hold the system accountable, you're fighting a battle just as important as any we faced in Afghanistan. Mike nodded, understanding the weight of the responsibility being placed on his shoulders and feeling ready to bear it. "There's one more thing," Colonel Blackwood said, handing him a business card with a private number. "This time, don't wait until things are desperate to call. I meant what I said in Afghanistan. No one gets left behind. Not then, not now, not ever." As they stepped outside into the bright Minneapolis morning, Mike was struck by how different the world looked compared to just 3 days ago. The same sun shone down, the same challenges existed in the veteran care system, but now he stood on the other side of despair, equipped not just with a new prosthetic, but with a new mission. Torres and Washington waited beside a van marked with the Frontline Forward logo. Beyond them, Mike could see the hospital helipad where the Black Hawk had landed, the dramatic intervention that had changed everything. "Colonel," he said suddenly, turning back to Blackwood, "that day at the airport, you could have just made a phone call. Arranged transportation, had someone pick me up. Why the helicopter? Why the full-dress uniform and the special forces? Team, it seems like overkill," she finished for him, a rare smile touching her lips. "It was deliberate, Rodriguez. Some injustices can be corrected quietly behind the scenes, but others need to be confronted in a way that forces everyone to pay attention. Your situation wasn't just about one man and one airport. It was about a pattern of neglect and disrespect that has become normalized." She straightened, her posture reflecting every inch of her authority. "Sometimes, Rodriguez, true leadership means making a statement that cannot be ignored or explained away. The helicopter, the uniform, the operators, they weren't excessive. They were necessary, because they ensured that what happened to you would never be just another complaint form filed away and forgotten." Mike understood then that Colonel Blackwood had orchestrated not just a rescue, but a reckoning, a dramatic confrontation that would ripple through systems and institutions, forcing change where quieter approaches had failed. "I won't let you." "Down, ma'am," he said, offering a crisp salute. Colonel Blackwood returned the salute with equal precision. "I know you won't, Sergeant. Now go change the world, one veteran at a time." As Mike walked toward Torres and Washington, toward his new purpose, he felt something he had lost months ago in the bureaucratic maze of disability claims and inadequate care. The quiet pride of a soldier with a clear mission and the means to accomplish it. Behind him, Colonel Blackwood watched his confident stride, noting with satisfaction how differently he moved, with the proper prosthetic and the renewed sense of purpose. Some battles were fought with weapons and tactics, others required helicopters landing at civilian airports and the moral authority to demand accountability from broken systems. Different battlefields, Same mission, leave no one behind. And as the frontline forward van pulled away, carrying Mike Rodriguez toward his new life as an advocate and champion for forgotten heroes, Colonel Blackwood knew that the most important phase of his service to his country wasn't in his past. It was just beginning. 1 year later, the banquet hall of the Grand Serenity Hotel in downtown Minneapolis glowed with soft lighting that reflected off crystal glasses and polished silverware. Tables draped in ivory linen filled the expansive space, each adorned with centerpieces of blue and gold, the colors of Frontline Forward. A stage dominated the front of the room, bearing a podium and the organization's logo, a silhouette of soldiers helping one another across difficult terrain. At the registration table, elegantly dressed attendees checked in for the first annual Rodriguez Protocol Benefit Gala. The event had sold out weeks in advance, drawing military leaders, politicians, corporate executives, and celebrities, all united by their commitment to improving the lives of disabled veterans. In a quiet room adjacent to the banquet hall, Mike Rodriguez adjusted his tie, still getting used to the feel of formal attire after years in uniform and then months in whatever clothes he could afford. The custom-tailored suit had been a gift from Charles Westfield, who had insisted that the keynote speaker at such a prestigious event should look the part. Mike's reflection in the mirror revealed a transformation that went far beyond clothing. The gaunt, defeated man who had been ejected from an airport a year ago had been replaced by someone standing tall and confident, his Genesis Pro X prosthetic barely noticeable beneath his pant leg. Regular meals, proper medical care, and meaningful work had restored not just his physical health but his spirit. A knock at the door preceded Rebecca Torres's entrance. As executive director of Frontline Forward, she had become both mentor and friend to Mike over the past year, guiding him as he developed into one of the organization's most effective advocates. "Almost showtime," she said with an encouraging smile. "Nervous?" Mike nodded honestly. "Terrified. Give me a combat patrol over public speaking any day." Torres laughed. "You've addressed congressional committees and stood up to hospital administrators who tried to deny veterans care. This crowd should be easy by comparison." "Those were battles," Mike replied. I don't know. Telling my story to 500 people feels different." "It's still a battle," Torres corrected him gently. "Just a different front in the same war. And your story is our most powerful weapon." She checked her watch. "The colonel just arrived. She'd like a word before we begin." Mike nodded, adjusting his tie one final time. "Send her in." Torres departed, and moments later, Colonel Blackwood entered. She wore her dress uniform adorned with combat medals and ribbons, her silver hair perfectly styled, her bearing as commanding as ever. But her eyes softened as she took in the sight of Mike in his suit. "Rodriguez," she greeted him. "You clean up well." "Thank you, ma'am," he replied with a smile. "So do you." The colonel's mouth quirked in amusement. "I've been wearing this uniform for 30 years. Not much of a transformation." She moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. "Are you ready for tonight?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Mike admitted. "Still can't quite believe we're here. A year ago, I was sitting on a curb outside Westfield Airport, and now you're the keynote speaker at a gala that will raise millions for veteran care and housing." Colonel Blackwood finished for him. "That's what happens when you refuse to accept that the system can't be changed." She turned from the window, facing him directly. "I've read your speech. It's good, powerful, but I want to make sure you understand something before you go out there." Mike waited, sensing the importance of whatever she was about to say. "The Rodriguez Protocol isn't just about airports or VA benefits or prosthetics," she said. "It's about a fundamental shift in how we perceive obligation. When a country sends its young people to war, it incurs a debt that can never fully be repaid, but must never be forgotten or minimized. What you're doing, what we're all doing here tonight, is reminding America of that ongoing obligation." Mike nodded, the weight of her words settling on him. "Tonight isn't about charity," the colonel continued. "It's about justice. Remember that when you speak, you're not asking for help for veterans, you're demanding what was promised to them. There's a world of difference between those positions." A soft knock at the door signaled it was time. Colonel Blackwood straightened, military bearing reasserting itself. "Show time, Rodriguez. Go make me proud." "Yes, ma'am," he replied, drawing himself up to his full height. Together, they walked to the banquet hall entrance. The buzz of conversation within fell silent as they appeared. 500 people rose to their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation, not just for Mike's personal journey, but for what he now represented: the possibility of transforming individual injustice into systemic change. Marcus Washington approached the podium as Mike and Colonel Blackwood took their seats at the head table. "Ladies and gentlemen," Washington began, "welcome to the first annual Rodriguez Protocol Benefit Gala. 1 year ago today, a disabled Afghanistan veteran was forcibly removed from an airport waiting area while trying to make a medical appointment for his prosthetic leg. That act of discrimination set in motion a series of events that would transform veteran care across the country." On large screens around the room, images appeared. Newspaper headlines about the Black Hawk landing at Westfield Airport. Photos of Mike with his new prosthetic, screenshots of the Rodriguez Protocol being adopted by airports, train stations, and public facilities nationwide. "What began as one man's humiliation," Washington continued, "has become a movement that has improved the lives of thousands of disabled veterans. Tonight, we celebrate not just the courage of that one veteran, but the power of principled action to create lasting change." He gestured toward the head table. "It is my great honor to introduce the man whose name has become synonymous with veteran dignity and rights, the director of our outreach and advocacy program, and my friend, Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez." The applause was thunderous as Mike rose and made his way to the podium. He looked out at the sea of faces: military officers, corporate leaders, celebrities, and most importantly, dozens of veterans whose lives had been directly improved by the Rodriguez Protocol and frontline forwards work. "1 year ago," Mike began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "I sat on a concrete planter outside Westfield Regional Airport, in pain, humiliated, and completely alone. My prosthetic leg was damaged. My disability benefits had been wrongfully suspended, and I had just been forcibly removed from the airport terminal where I was waiting for a delayed flight to a medical appointment." The room was completely silent, hundreds of people hanging on his every word. "I had given my leg, my health, and nearly my life for my country in Afghanistan. And yet, in that moment, I felt utterly abandoned by the nation I had sworn to defend." Mike paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle. What happened next changed everything, not just for me, but for thousands of veterans across America. He recounted the story of his call to Colonel Blackwood, the dramatic arrival of the Black Hawk, the confrontation with airport management, and the systemic changes that followed. As he spoke, images continued to appear on the screens. Colonel Blackwood in full dress uniform striding through the airport, Mike's first steps with his new prosthetic, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for Frontline Forward's new housing facility for disabled veterans. The Rodriguez Protocol began as airport policy, Mike continued, but it has grown into something much larger. Today, it's being implemented in transportation hubs, government buildings, hospitals, and public spaces across all 50 states. Its core principle is simple but powerful. Those who have sacrificed for their country deserve accommodation, respect, and dignity, not as a courtesy, but as a right. He gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward slightly. In the past, your frontline forward has helped over 3,000 veterans navigate the complexities of the VA system. We've secured proper housing for 600 disabled veterans who were on the verge of homelessness. We've expedited prosthetic and adaptive equipment upgrades for more than 800 wounded warriors. And we've trained staff at 93 airports and transit centers on proper accommodation for disabled veterans. Pride shone in Mike's eyes as he continued. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Behind each statistic is a person, a man or woman, who served their country, who sacrificed, who deserves better than what they were receiving. The screens now showed photographs of veterans who had been helped by Frontline Forward, a former Marine learning to use his new prosthetic arms, an Army veteran moving into her first stable housing in years, a Navy corpsman receiving long-delayed specialized care for traumatic brain injury. These are the faces of the Rodriguez Protocol in action, Mike said. These are the battles we fight every day, not with weapons, but with advocacy, education, and when necessary, with the kind of dramatic intervention that Colonel Blackwood demonstrated at Westfield Airport. He gestured toward Colonel Blackwood, who sat ramrod straight at the head table, her expression composed, but her eyes shining with unmistakable pride. I stand before you tonight, not as a victim of a broken system, but as living proof that systems can change when enough people demand it. The Rodriguez Protocol isn't just about accommodating disabled veterans. It's about recognizing that the debt we owe to those who serve doesn't end when the uniform comes off or when the wounds of war become inconvenient. Mike stepped away from the podium, moving to the center of the stage where his prosthetic leg was partially visible beneath his pant leg. A year ago, I was ashamed of this, he said, gesturing to his prosthetic. Not because I had lost my leg, I've always been proud of my service, but because society made me feel like my disability was a burden, an inconvenience, something to be hidden away or minimized. He straightened to his full height. I'm not ashamed anymore. This prosthetic isn't a symbol of what I lost. It's a testament to what I gave, and the same is true for every wounded veteran. Their scars, visible and invisible, aren't marks of defeat. They're badges of honor that deserve our utmost respect and accommodation. The audience rose in another standing ovation. Mike waited for the applause to subside before continuing. Tonight, your generosity will help us expand the Rodriguez Protocol to more facilities, train more staff, and most importantly, reach more veterans who don't know that help is available. But I ask you to do more than write checks. I ask you to become advocates in your own communities, to look at disabled veterans not with pity, but with the respect due to those who have given pieces of themselves in service to their country. His voice grew stronger, more passionate. When you see a veteran struggling with prosthetics or mobility issues in a public space, don't look away. Ask if they need assistance. When you encounter policies that create barriers for disabled veterans, challenge them. When you hear someone suggest that caring for wounded warriors is too expensive or too complicated, remind them that the true cost of war isn't measured in dollars spent on care. It's measured in the lives and limbs of those who serve. Mike paused, looking directly at Colonel Blackwood. A wise leader once told me that the true measure of a society isn't found in its grand buildings or economic statistics, but in how it treats those who have sacrificed the most for its protection. Tonight, we have an opportunity to raise that measure, to say with one voice that in America no veteran fights alone, not on the battlefield and not at home. As Mike concluded his speech, the screens displayed a final image, the official Rodriguez Protocol insignia that now appeared in airports and public facilities nationwide, a simple design showing a prosthetic leg alongside the words honor, respect, accommodate. This symbol, Mike said, pointing to the image, represents a promise. A promise that what happened to me at Westfield Airport won't happen to another veteran. A promise that the sacrifices made by those who serve will never be forgotten or minimized. A promise that in America, we leave no one behind, not in combat, and not when they come home. The applause was deafening as Mike returned to his seat. Colonel Blackwood leaned over, her voice audible only to him despite the noise. "Well done, Rodriguez. That wasn't just a speech, that was a mission statement." The gala continued with dinner, testimonials from veterans who had been helped by Frontline Forward, and a fundraising auction that ultimately raised over $3 million for the organization's programs. Throughout the evening, a steady stream of attendees approached Mike to share stories, offer support, or simply thank him for his service, both in Afghanistan and in the year since his return. As the event drew to a close, Charles Westfield, the airport CEO, whose company had been the first to implement the Rodriguez Protocol, took the stage for a final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Westfield Airport Group is proud to announce the establishment of the Rodriguez Veterans Transportation Fund, a $10 million endowment that will ensure that no veteran ever misses a medical appointment due to lack of transportation. This fund will provide free transit to VA facilities nationwide for any veteran with a service-connected disability." The announcement brought the crowd to its feet once more. Mike, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the impact his story had created, found himself blinking back tears. Later, as the banquet hall emptied and the event staff began clearing tables, Mike stood by the window overlooking the city, lost in thought. Colonel Blackwood joined him, her reflection appearing beside his in the glass. "Penny for your thoughts, Rodriguez?" Mike smiled. "Just thinking about how different things look from this side of the window. A year ago, I was outside looking in, wondering if anyone cared. Now you're changing the world," she finished for him. "One policy, one veteran, one day at a time." "We're changing it," Mike corrected her. "None of this would have happened without you and that Black Hawk." Colonel Blackwood shook her head. "The helicopter was just a tool, Rodriguez. The real change began when you decided to make that call, when you refused to accept that your suffering was necessary or normal. I just provided the exclamation point." She turned from the window to face him directly. "Do you remember what I told you that day at the Minneapolis VA when you asked why I brought a helicopter to an airport dispute?" Mike nodded. "You said some injustices need to be confronted in a way that forces everyone to pay attention." "Exactly," she confirmed. "And that's what you've been doing every day since, forcing America to pay attention to its wounded warriors. The helicopter got people's attention, but you've kept it. That's the harder task by far." Rebecca Torres approached, tablet in hand. "Sorry to interrupt, but we have some incredible news. The donation total for tonight just crossed $5 million, and 7 more airport groups have signed on to implement the Rodriguez Protocol, which means we're now at over 300 airports nationwide." Colonel Blackwood smiled. "Not bad for a year's work, Rodriguez." As Torres moved away to share the news with others, Mike turned back to the window, watching the city lights shimmer against the night sky. "Sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed, from that curb outside the airport to this." "It's not about the location, Rodriguez," Colonel Blackwood said quietly. "It's about the mission. Your mission changed, but your purpose didn't. To serve, to protect, to make a difference. You're still doing that, just in a different uniform." She placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, a rare gesture of physical connection from the usually reserved officer. The real victory isn't this gala or the millions raised or even the protocol itself. It's that somewhere tonight, a disabled veteran is sitting in an airport waiting area, being treated with dignity, receiving the accommodation they need, and not having to fight for what should be freely given. Mike nodded, understanding the profound truth in her words. The true measure of their success wasn't found in banquet halls or fundraising totals, but in the daily experiences of veterans who would never know the humiliation he had endured. "Same mission, different battlefield," he said softly. "Exactly," Colonel Blackwood agreed, "and on this battlefield, Rodriguez, we're winning." As they stood together, looking out at the city, Mike reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the concrete curb outside Westfield Airport, to this moment of triumph and purpose. The path had been marked by pain and sacrifice, but also by the unbreakable bonds of those who serve and the power of principled action to create lasting change. The Rodriguez Protocol had begun as one man's humiliation transformed by one colonel's dramatic intervention. It had become a movement, a standard, a new covenant between a nation and those who defend it, a promise that no veteran would be left behind, forgotten, or treated with anything less than the full measure of dignity their service had earned. And that, Mike realized, was a mission worth fighting for, one helicopter landing, one policy change, one veteran at a time. 3 years later, the congressional hearing room hummed with anticipation. Cameras from every major news network were positioned strategically around the chamber, their red lights indicating live broadcasts to millions of Americans. The gallery was packed with spectators, veterans in uniform or wearing service caps, disability advocates with their organization logos prominently displayed, and ordinary citizens who had traveled from across the country to witness this historic moment. At the witness table sat Mike Rodriguez, now Executive Director of Frontline Forward, following Rebecca Torres's retirement the previous year. His dark suit was impeccable, his posture military straight, his expression composed despite the momentous nature of the proceedings. Beside him sat Colonel Sarah Blackwood, recently promoted to Brigadier General, her uniform adorned with medals that testified to decades of distinguished service. Behind them, filling several rows of seats, were dozens of veterans whose lives had been transformed by the Rodriguez Protocol, men and women of all ages, branches of service, and types of disability. Their presence was both symbolic and practical. Each had a story that demonstrated why today's hearing was so essential. Senator Eleanor Marshall, chair of the Veterans Affairs Committee, gavelled the session to order. At 72, she was a respected legislator with a reputation for cutting through political theater to achieve meaningful results. "This hearing of the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs is now in session," she announced, her voice carrying authority that silenced the murmurs in the room. "Today we consider Senate Bill 4732, the Disabled Veterans Dignity and Accommodation Act, commonly known as the Rodriguez Protocol Act." She looked directly at Mike and General Blackwood. This proposed legislation would codify into federal law the standards and practices that began 4 years ago at Westfield Regional Airport and have since been voluntarily adopted by transportation hubs, government facilities, and public accommodations across the nation. Senator Marshall adjusted her glasses, surveying the packed chamber. "Before we hear from our witnesses, I want to acknowledge the significance of this moment. It is rare that a congressional hearing attracts this level of public attention. It is rarer still that a piece of legislation named after a living American comes before this body. The fact that both are occurring today speaks to the profound impact that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and what became known as the Rodriguez Protocol have had on our national conversation about how we treat those who have sacrificed for our country." She nodded toward Mike. "Mr. Rodriguez, As the executive director of Frontline Forward and the person whose experience inspired this legislation, you have the floor. Mike adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began. Chairwoman Marshall, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. 4 years ago, I was forcibly removed from an airport terminal while waiting for a flight to a VA medical appointment. My crime was being a disabled veteran with a damaged prosthetic leg who needed to rest while waiting for a delayed flight. The room was completely silent as Mike continued, recounting the now familiar story of his humiliation at Westfield Airport, General Blackwood's dramatic intervention, and the grassroots movement that had grown into a national campaign for veteran dignity. What began as an airport policy has evolved into a comprehensive framework for how public spaces and services should accommodate disabled veterans, Mike explained. The Rodriguez Protocol isn't about special treatment or charity. It's about ensuring that those who have given parts of themselves in service to this nation can navigate public spaces with dignity and receive the accommodation they have earned through their sacrifice. Mike gestured to the veterans seated behind him. These men and women represent thousands more whose lives have been improved by voluntary adoption of the Rodriguez Protocol. But voluntary compliance is inconsistent and incomplete. That's why federal legislation is necessary to ensure that every disabled veteran in every part of this country receives the accommodation and respect they deserve. For the next hour, Mike detailed the key provisions of the proposed legislation, mandatory accommodation standards for all federally funded transportation hubs and government buildings, training requirements for staff who interact with disabled veterans, expedited security and check-in procedures for veterans with mobility challenges, dedicated liaison officers in major transportation centers, and legal remedies for veterans who experience discrimination. As he spoke, screens in the hearing room displayed statistics, testimonials, and before and after comparisons of facilities that had implemented the protocol. The presentation was comprehensive, professional, and compelling, far from the desperate veteran who had once sat dejected on an airport curb. In conclusion, Mike said, nearing the end of his testimony, this legislation represents America's promise to its wounded warriors, that their sacrifice will be honored not just with words and ceremonies, but with concrete actions that recognize their ongoing needs and challenges. The Rodriguez Protocol Act won't erase the physical and psychological wounds of war, but it will ensure that those wounds aren't compounded by indifference, bureaucracy, or discrimination. He looked directly at the committee members. 4 years ago, it took a Black Hawk helicopter and a colonel's intervention to secure dignity for one disabled veteran. With your support, we can ensure that such dramatic measures are never again necessary, because the proper treatment of our wounded warriors will be the law of the land, not the exception to the rule. Senator Marshall nodded thoughtfully. Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. General Blackwood, do you have testimony to add before we move to questions? General Blackwood leaned toward her microphone. Yes, Madam Chairwoman, I'll be brief. She straightened in her chair, her bearing reflecting decades of command. 4 years ago, I made a decision to divert military resources, specifically a Black Hawk helicopter and special operations personnel, to address what some might consider a civilian matter. I did so because I recognized that what happened to Sergeant Rodriguez wasn't just a personal injustice, but a systemic failure that demanded an extraordinary response. Her voice carried throughout the chamber without her appearing to raise it, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. As military leaders, we promise our troops that we will leave no one behind on the battlefield. That commitment doesn't end when they return home or when they transition to civilian life. The Rodriguez Protocol Act simply codifies what should already be our national practice: treating those who have sacrificed for our security with the dignity, respect, and accommodation they have earned. She looked directly at the committee members. I appear before you today not just as a general officer, but as someone who has witnessed firsthand how proper accommodation can transform the lives of wounded warriors. This legislation isn't about politics or partisanship. It's about America keeping its promises to those who have kept theirs to America, often at tremendous personal cost. The questioning that followed was rigorous, but largely supportive. Even senators known for their fiscal conservatism seemed moved by the testimony and the visible presence of so many disabled veterans whose lives would be directly affected by the legislation. Senator James Whitfield, a decorated Vietnam veteran himself, leaned forward. Mr. Rodriguez, some critics have suggested that creating special accommodations for veterans, as opposed to all disabled Americans, creates an unnecessary two-tier system. How would you respond to that concern? Mike nodded, having anticipated this question. Senator, the Rodriguez Protocol doesn't seek to diminish or replace the Americans with Disabilities Act, which remains essential for all disabled citizens. Rather, it recognizes the unique circumstances of those whose disabilities were acquired in service to the nation. A veteran who lost a limb in combat, suffered a traumatic brain injury from an IED, or developed PTSD from the horrors of war has made a sacrifice that deserves specific recognition and accommodation. He continued, his voice growing more passionate. Furthermore, the protocol addresses unique challenges that combat-disabled veterans face, triggers for PTSD that civilians rarely encounter, complex prosthetics that require special handling in security situations, and medical appointments at VA facilities that are often time-sensitive and life-critical. These aren't arbitrary distinctions. They're recognitions of the specific sacrifices and ongoing needs of those who served. The questioning continued for nearly 2 hours, with Mike and General Blackwood deftly addressing concerns about implementation costs, training requirements, and enforcement mechanisms. Throughout, they maintained a consistent message. The Rodriguez Protocol Act wasn't creating new entitlements. It was fulfilling existing obligations to those who had given so much for their country. As the hearing neared its conclusion, Senator Marshall called on the final scheduled witness, Gerald Reynolds, the former airport supervisor who had removed Mike from Westfield Airport 4 years earlier. Reynolds approached the witness table, looking considerably different from the officious manager who had once prioritized policy over compassion. His manner was subdued, his expression reflective rather than defensive. Mr. Reynolds, Senator Marshall began, you've requested the opportunity to address this committee regarding the legislation under consideration. Please proceed. Reynolds adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and began. Chairwoman, Marshall Committee members, Mr. Rodriguez, General Blackwood, thank you for allowing me to speak today. 4 years ago, I made a decision that I will regret for the rest of my life. I enforced an airport policy without consideration for the human being sitting before me, a wounded warrior who had given more for his country than I could ever comprehend. He paused, visibly collecting himself. After I was terminated from Westfield Airport, I struggled to find employment. No one wanted to hire the man who had thrown out a disabled veteran and triggered what became known as the Black Hawk incident. I became angry, resentful, convinced that I was the victim of an overreaction to a simple policy enforcement. Reynolds looked directly at Mike. It took almost a year of reflection, and honestly, financial hardship, before I truly understood the magnitude of my failure that day. It wasn't just a lapse in judgment, it was a failure of humanity, of empathy, of the basic respect owed to someone who had sacrificed for our country. The room was utterly silent as Reynolds continued. 2 years ago, I reached out to Frontline, Forward, not seeking forgiveness but offering to share my perspective, to help train staff on what not to do. To my surprise, Mr. Rodriguez not only accepted my offer, but encouraged me to develop a comprehensive training program for transportation staff on accommodating disabled veterans. He gestured toward the gallery, where several people nodded in recognition. Today, I lead the Protocol Compliance Training Division at Frontline Forward, working with airports, train stations, and bus terminals nationwide to implement the very standards that I once disregarded. The irony isn't lost on me, but neither is the opportunity for redemption. Reynolds turned to address the committee directly. I appear before you today to urge passage of the Rodriguez Protocol Act, not despite my experience, but because of it. Without clear federal standards and mandatory training, there will be more Gerald Reynoldses making the same terrible mistake I made, prioritizing rules over people, efficiency over dignity, policies over moral obligations to our veterans. His voice grew stronger, more convicted. This legislation isn't just about accommodating disabilities. It's about changing institutional cultures that too often forget the human beings behind the policies. It's about ensuring that no veteran ever again has to suffer the indignity that Sergeant Rodriguez experienced at my hands. When Reynolds concluded his testimony, the impact on the hearing room was palpable. His journey from antagonist to advocate provided a powerful bookend to the story that had begun 4 years earlier on that airport curb. Senator Marshall thanked the witnesses and announced that the committee would reconvene the following week for a vote on moving the legislation to the Senate floor. As the hearing adjourned, the room buzzed with conversation, much of it centered on the powerful testimonies they had just witnessed. Mike found himself surrounded by veterans and advocates, offering congratulations and support. General Blackwood stood slightly apart, allowing him his moment in the spotlight while maintaining a watchful presence. After years of working together on the protocol, they had developed a partnership that transcended their former ranks. She was no longer just his commanding officer, and he was no longer just her soldier. They were collaborators in a mission that had grown far beyond either of them. Later that evening, Mike, General Blackwood, and key members of Frontline Forward gathered in a private dining room at a restaurant near Capitol Hill. The mood was cautiously celebratory. The hearing had gone well, but the legislative process was far from complete. "The committee vote looks promising," Marcus Washington reported, reviewing notes on his tablet. "We have solid bipartisan support, and Senator Marshall's staff indicates she plans to fast-track the bill to the floor." Rebecca Torres, who had come out of retirement to advise on the legislative push, nodded agreement. "The House version already has enough co-sponsors to pass. If we clear the Senate, this could be on the president's desk within months, not years." Mike absorbed this information with a mixture of hope and disbelief. 4 years ago, I was just trying to get to a medical appointment without collapsing from pain. Now we're talking about federal legislation that could help thousands of veterans. General Blackwood, seated at the head of the table, raised her water glass. "To the journey," she said simply, "from an airport curb to the halls of Congress." As glasses clinked around the table, a young aide entered the dining room and whispered something to Washington, who broke into a broad smile. "I've just received word," Washington announced to the group, "that the American Transportation Association, representing over 80% of the nation's airports, train stations, and bus terminals, has just issued a statement formally endorsing the Rodriguez Protocol Act. They're calling on Congress to pass it without delay." A cheer went up from the group. This endorsement from the industry that would be most affected by the legislation removed one of the final potential obstacles to passage. As the celebration continued around him, Mike found himself momentarily overwhelmed. He stepped away from the table and moved to the window, looking out at the illuminated dome of the Capitol in the distance. General Blackwood joined him a moment later. "Penny for your thoughts, Rodriguez." Mike smiled at the familiar phrase, just thinking about how far we've come and how much further we still have to go. That's always the case with meaningful change, she replied. It's never complete, never perfect, but it moves forward, sometimes in increments, sometimes in leaps. Like a Black Hawk landing at a regional airport, Mike suggested with a raised eyebrow. General Blackwood's mouth curved in a rare smile. Exactly like that. Sometimes you need a dramatic gesture to crack open a closed system. But then comes the harder work, the sustained effort to keep that system open and responsive. She turned to face the Capitol alongside him. The legislation matters, Rodriguez. It will make a real difference in countless lives. But never forget that laws are just frameworks. They still require people of good conscience to implement them with humanity and understanding. Mike nodded thoughtfully. That's why Gerald Reynolds' testimony today was so important. He represents the human side of institutional change, the possibility that people can learn, grow, and become champions for the very causes they once opposed. His redemption arc is quite something, General Blackwood agreed. From the man who threw you out to one of our most effective advocates. If he can change that profoundly, perhaps there's hope for all our institutions. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the city lights glimmer against the darkening sky. So much had changed since that fateful day at Westfield Airport, not just for Mike personally, but for thousands of veterans across the country. The Rodriguez Protocol had become more than a policy or a program. It had become a movement, a standard, a new way of honoring the sacrifices of those who served. We should rejoin the others, General Blackwood said finally. Tomorrow will be another full day of meetings and media interviews. As they turned back toward the table where their colleagues continued celebrating, Mike was struck by a sudden realization. You know, General, 4 years ago when you landed that Black Hawk, I thought it was about rescuing one veteran from a bad situation. I never imagined it would lead to all of this. General Blackwood regarded him steadily. That's because you were thinking tactically, Rodriguez. I was thinking strategically. That helicopter wasn't just about you. It was about creating a moment so dramatic, so undeniable, that it would force a conversation about how we treat our wounded warriors. Her voice softened slightly. But I never could have predicted how perfectly suited you would be to carry that conversation forward, to transform a moment of crisis into a movement for change. That part wasn't strategy, that was just you being you. Mike felt a surge of pride at her words. Praise from General Blackwood was rare and therefore precious. Thank you, Ma'am, for everything. Don't thank me yet, Rodriguez, she replied, echoing words she had spoken years earlier in Minneapolis. Thank me when the President signs that bill into law and the Rodriguez Protocol becomes the standard across America. As they rejoined their colleagues at the table, Mike reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from the battlefields of Afghanistan to the halls of Congress, from a wounded warrior fighting personal battles to an advocate changing national policy. The path had been marked by pain and struggle, but also by purpose and redemption, not just for him, but for everyone touched by the protocol that bore his name. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more hearings, more battles for the dignity of disabled veterans. But tonight, looking around at the dedicated team that had formed around this mission, Mike Rodriguez knew with absolute certainty that no veteran would ever again have to face those battles alone. The Black Hawk had landed, the message had been delivered, and the nation was finally listening. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.